Nathan Gill, Being, the Bottom Line. Just the very ordinary. Seems to me that even the ease of being you refer to, Nathan, in your book, Already Awake, could be viewed as something out of the ordinary, and therefore something that may become the subject of seeking. Yes, the focus of seeking could be ease. Nathan, I can only speak for myself here, of course, but I think it's important to say that seeking can disappear, and that what's left doesn't need to be described as ease or anything else of that nature. An ordinary life is an ordinary life. Maybe that life is even extraordinary in its very ordinariness. Well, how does that ordinary life manifest in your case? Sometimes there's struggling with bodily discomfort. Sometimes there's involvement with dramas and crises. And yet there's an intuitive knowing that things couldn't be any different. I literally am this body and all of its woes. In the living of life, in living it completely in all of its ordinariness, there's none of the additional tension of struggling to try to change what's happening. Things that need to get done seem to get done quite naturally. For instance, if I cut myself while I'm gardening, it seems as though it's me who has to go and get a plaster. I don't just lie on the lawn and bleed to death. Although that could happen if I was in the mood for it. This life has also had its share of extraordinary. When I was 21, I was working in Australia, where I met Swami Muktananda. I saw him several times and received Shaktipat from him. The next year I spent in total bliss. I was completely in love with Baba Muktananda. But I travelled back to England, and as soon as my feet touched the tarmac, all hell broke loose. The difficulties I'd experienced in my life up until I first met Baba returned with a vengeance. I spent the next few years travelling the world, visiting and living in Baba's ashrams, meditating, chanting, serving, forever chasing that state I'd experienced in Australia. I don't regret any of it. I love Baba to this day. I had some great adventures. I made many friends. It was very exciting. At the same time, though, there was always a feeling that something was missing. My body was never very strong. And in the end of life, of chanting and meditating and service, working long hours, coupled with all the bliss and also the mental anguish I often went through, it just burned me out. And eventually I settled back in England. And although I maintained my links with Baba's organisation, I was content to live a quiet life, meeting up with friends from time to time, attending satsangs and visiting teachers from around the world. I still attend satsangs, even today, and occasionally I read a new book if it takes my fancy, but somewhere along the line, the interest in enlightenment completely fell away. My quiet life in this little village is all I ever really wanted. For much of the time it's characterised by peacefulness that couldn't be equalled by the most sublime of the states of blissfulness I previously experienced. And yet I wouldn't refer to myself as awakened. And I couldn't give a hoot whether there's an I here or not. So even the term ease, by seeming to indicate something other than life just as it is, could inadvertently promote seeking. Yes, I take your point. However, I'm not making a prescription for ease or for the ending of seeking. What's already appearing is the perfect expression of being. The talks are merely a description of this. Okay, Nathan, this prescription thing leads me on to another point. I've read several books where the author describes their awakening to the absence of personal self. They explain that this falling away of the sense of personal self happens spontaneously, because obviously there's no personal self that could make it happen. And then they go on to prescribe certain things that the reader can do. Surrender, meditation, self-inquiry. To precipitate such a falling away, you're told there's no personal self, but nevertheless, suggestions are made as how you can get rid of yourself. It all seems very misleading. Surely, if it's all oneness, it doesn't matter whether there's an I here or not. Yes, it's all being. Whatever appears is merely a play of fleeting appearances. Yeah, the idea, Nathan, of enlightenment seems so relevant now. Why be endlessly chasing what isn't? Whether there's the sense of a personal self or not, these bodies will die, and the apparent problems of a personal self aren't going to go beyond the grave. I guess to most people it's unacceptable living in this life in an ordinary way without chasing after something better. But if the focus is on what's already happening rather than constantly looking to the future, it's obvious in a very simple way that this is actually all there is. Unconditional apathy. Nathan, what about love? What about apathy? No, Nathan, I mean unconditional love. It's all unconditional. Memory. Does memory refer to another now? No, there's only presence. So it doesn't refer to another now that no longer is? No. What does it refer to then? Memory is a story arising presently about what supposedly has happened. It has no validity apart from as a story. There is actually no history. There's only presence. What you're saying seems just too obvious. It is obvious, but when there's a belief that the story, in reality, it tends to get overlooked. The story diverts attention in favour of an alternative reality of past and future, where reminiscing and longing appear more attractive than embellished direct seeing. But outside of a talk environment, Nathan, I've heard you answer a question about your past. When the story seems to be exclusive reality, apparent suffering may arise in relation to events that appear to be happening to me, or in remembering and anticipating such events. But when life isn't viewed exclusively through the veil of thought, then living unfolds as if that which the story relates is real, as if there is a past and a future. When the story is no longer viewed as the exclusive reality, there isn't the continuity that constitutes a me. So stories arise, memory, thoughts arise, but they're not taken to be what I am. Compassion and detachment. Nathan, what about compassion? If I see someone suffering, I'm going to help them. As a liberated being, could you just walk away from that? Just let the person die or whatever? Everything is happening entirely spontaneously, so help would either be given or not, regardless of whether there was any thought story happening in relation to that. What's more interesting in your question is the idea that there are liberated beings. Fascination with liberation might be is based on the initial assumption of a me that can be, or needs to be, liberated. And on the further assumption that it actually this me that itself becomes liberated. If that fascination should relax, it'd be obvious that all ideas and speculation about liberation are based merely on unexamined assumptions. I'll put the question differently then. Say that liberation was the case here, and I didn't help someone who was suffering. There wouldn't be any agonizing about that, would there? The question is still based on the assumption of a me who can be liberated. Whether or not there would be any agonizing is beside the point. Once again, the real issue here is the fascination with how I, as a liberated character, might react to various situations. Reinforces the idea that there's someone here in the first place, and that someone can become liberated. Nathan, I can't see the detachment in that. What detachment? Well, liberation is supposed to mean that there's no longer attachment to anything. In all of this focusing on these supposed attributes of liberation, what's being overlooked is the possibility that the assumed character, who feels the need to escape into liberation as an avoidance of what presently is arising, isn't actually here anyway. In presence, this is all there is. And the possibility of escaping present discomfort through liberation isn't entertained. Without an idealized state of liberation occupying attention, there may no longer be any impulse to change what simply is. Compassion, detachment, any agonizing over these will be seen as part of the story of me. And as it simply is a story, no liberation from it is necessary. Everything appears because you are. Nathan, it seems as if the difference between you and me is that there's a knowing, that everything's being, whereas there doesn't seem to be that knowing here. There is no over there. Everything is appearing here, right where you are, including both the image of Nathan here and also the idea that there's an internal sense of being inside Nathan that knows. But Nathan sees that or knows that, and I don't. Simple presence right here is overlooked in favour of the assumption that there's an internal someone inside of Nathan over there. Actually, to you, Nathan is a visual image and some sounds appearing in awareness. That there is life inside Nathan is an assumption. Assumptions are fine, all parts of the play of life. But with such an assumption also arises a sense of lack. Life always appears to be out there, passing me by. But actually life is only ever happening here. Being is always right here, the ground for the appearance of everything. Being is what you are, and without being, Nathan couldn't even appear. Everything appears because you are. Identification and liberation are both impersonal. Nathan, whenever there's some crisis or other, the focus on it is such that identification seems inevitable. So the big story here is that life's not okay and needs to be resolved through pursuing liberation. Liberation is not the answer to problems, and certainly isn't the end result of any kind process. However, whenever there's an identification with a story of my life, then quite likely that story will include the compulsion to do something about any problems. Maybe then liberation is viewed as being the answer. But how can you avoid identifying with the story? There's no I outside of the thought story that can avoid identifying. The I that would avoid identification is an integral part of the story that arises in the play of life. And in the spontaneous seeing of this, there's no need to avoid identification. It's obvious that everything is a play of appearances arising presently in awareness. It's not an I that sees this. The I cannot see or avoid identifying with anything. The I is thought, and thought has no capacity for action of any kind. Thoughts are just images appearing and disappearing in awareness. So, although it's not being done by an entity, identification with the images that appear in awareness may be happening. Or maybe there's clear seeing that there is no one. Nathan, is this why liberation is impersonal? Because there's no one left when it happens. Identification is also impersonal, because there's actually no one who identifies. There's no one there in the first place. Identification happens as part of the play of life, but not to a someone. Even being a person is impersonal, because actually there are no entities at all. But Nathan, even if there's no one who identifies, identification is totally different in quality to liberation. Whenever there's identification, there's seeming separation and an attendant sense of lack in some degree or other, a sense of something missing. What's referred to as liberation, on the other hand, is the clear seeing that there's no one, no separate entity, and therefore no sense of lack. But there's no one to whom either identification or liberation is happening. No one who can bring either of them about. Identification and liberation are both impersonal. Both are possibilities in the play of life. And while the difference between them will appear significant, that significance is relevant only in the play. Being is the bottom line in all of this. It's the ground that allows the expression of all possibilities, and that has no dependence on any happening in the play. It is this present expression just as it appears, whether that expression should be identification or liberation. This is all there is. No difference. With regard to your life story, as you've previously told it to me, I must relate a similar story, that of a young man who came to a recent talk. He said that until his mid-teens, his experience of life excluded any sense of separation. All the various characters in the play or movie of life, including himself, appeared on the screen as visually differentiated images. But there's no sense of separation in a psychological sense, although there was a sense of location from which the movie of life was viewed. He simply didn't experience anything as other than his own being. He lived comfortably, happily into his teen years before he realized that the other characters in the movie were behaving as though bodily location was actual rather than apparent. This realization presented something of a dilemma. It now appeared that something was wrong. It suddenly appeared as though there was a dimension of being that was closed to him, and that life would not be complete without it. Because of this perceived lack, his previously happy existence became a torment. This torment continued into his early 20s, and when he went to talk on a non-duality, he was amazed and relieved to discover that the lack of psychological differentiation that was natural to him was considered desirable, that the characters at the talk were actually pursuing it. My story differs in that the recognition that others experience life from the point of view of separation came to me earlier when I was a child. My reaction to it was also different. It felt as though there was some game going on to which I was not privy, and I felt confused. And all of the others in the game seemed to have a purpose, and they seemed to know that they were supposed to be doing something, but I was just watching and drifting along with the events. For me, life is more like watching a movie rather than being an active participant in it. There's no sense of self in relation to others. There is consequently no standpoint for initiating actions. Everything just happens to me, or rather in me. Being, for me, is identical to all that is. I have never had problems because there has never been a separate someone to have them. But the whole range of emotions and life circumstances, pleasant and unpleasant, arise here, just as they do wherever there's seeming identification. Of course, as a child, there was no understanding of this, just the raw living of it. And so there's a feeling of being left out, of not being in on the secret that all the others shared. But just like the young man you spoke of, I too stumbled across the fact that in one way or another, nearly all of the characters are seeking for liberation from the sense of separation, whereas to me, the absence of separation has always been entirely natural. Relief arose at this discovery, and there's delight whenever I hear, expressed in words, what to me has always been obvious. I can see theoretically that from the point of view of separation, an event of release from that separation would probably be delightful. To me, however, the concept that there is a difference between separation and oneness is a strange one, because separation is only a condition that arises as an expression of oneness in oneness. In fact, there's never actually any separation.